Jay Costa, PA Senate Minority Leader, what has to fall in place before Pennsylvania's budget is finalized?
I think we have to come to grips with a spend number and what that number needs to be. The governor's made his proposal and around $48 billion. We have to come to reach a consensus. And then once we do that, then some of the major elements of a budget come into play: education, economic development, and so many other things. So that's quite frankly what the hang up is right now.
And what's the overall fiscal condition here in Pennsylvania anyway, just to give some context to this whole discussion?
I believe that the fiscal condition of Pennsylvania is very strong. We start with about a little over $7 billion in our rainy day fund. In our financial statements for the year, we are running in excess of a $7 billion surplus that we've been carrying, which puts us at $14 billion. And as we sit here today and have this conversation, our revenues for the state that we projected last year, last June or so, are running about $850 to $900 million over what we projected. So we are likely to have approximately a $15 billion surplus that we can work with to make investments in Pennsylvania, and that's what we're struggling with. We know that the financial condition is strong, but we also have to take steps to be thoughtful and strategic and make these thoughtful investments in a variety of spaces, and without impacting significantly the surplus that we have. So we don't find ourselves 5, 6, 7 years out in a situation where we may need to raise taxes and the like. So we're being thoughtful along those lines, but we have to figure out how to best find out what that special number is right now, and that's what we're working on.
A significant part of the governor's budget proposal has to do with funding for basic education. And what has to be worked out there?
A couple things have to be worked out. A spend number with respect to what we're going to provide to all 500 school districts, to the BEF formula, as well as the areas of special education and early learning and higher ed. But also, most importantly, as folks may know, our Commonwealth Court has struck as unconstitutional our funding system for education here in Pennsylvania, resulted in us having put together a basic education funding commission that analyzed the funding along the lines of adequacy and tax equity in Pennsylvania. They came back with a report that was adopted that said we have approximately a $6 billion inadequate funding stream in Pennsylvania that needs to be addressed. They recommended that we do it over 7 years. Governor Shapiro has come forward and implemented and recommended the first year of spending in terms of the adequacy and tax equity side, what needs to be done. What that means is that school districts that for a number of years historically have been underfunded and funded inadequately, and that this is designed over 7 years to make up for that adequacy gap. Mm-hmm. Now, there are a number of schools that will do well, and there are some schools that will not do well. There's some schools that won't get any money in adequacy or tax equity because of the way the formula was constructed. So at the end of the day, that's a big part of the challenge. But that's the biggest part of the general governor's budget address. I mean, we're looking in excess of like governor's proposal was about a little over $1 billion. I think $1.707. But I also think there's money for fixing facilities for about a $1.3 billion request. We're working to try to achieve as much as that as possible from our Democratic side, and we're hopeful that we are successful. But the big question is the distribution of those dollars, and I think that's one of the hangups right now.
Yeah, talk more about that, Senator, because hearing about an increase is one thing, but we also want to make sure that the schools that need the money the most get it. Is there some mechanism in the budget that will ensure that?
Yeah, there's the adequacy funding proposal that's part of the conversation. And as I said, there's two parts of it. There's the BEF line item, the basic education funding line item, with the governor proposed $200 million, that all 500 school districts will receive a piece of that. The question becomes what happens with the adequacy. When you run the numbers for the 500 school districts, there's a number of school districts do not benefit at all from that recalculation or the use of that adequacy. And that's becoming an issue that we're trying to reconcile. How do we make sure that the school districts that need it the most are able to be awarded those resources, but also recognizing that there could be some issues with the school districts that maybe just don't make the cut. And that's going to create a disparity with respect to what school districts are getting in one part of the county, for example, or another. For example, my county, there are a number of suburban school districts that do well. The city of Pittsburgh and some other school districts don't do quite as well. So that's the challenge that we have, to try to craft a formula that allows us the opportunity to be able to do the best we can for as many school districts as possible.
Now, a couple minutes ago, you said the governor wants to stretch his spending plan for education over a span of 7 years, and that is causing some Republicans concern. Why do it that way?
Well, I think the commission has recommended that we spend it over 7 years, and the governor is simply implementing the first year of that funding. It remains to be seen what happens in years 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Our hope and expectation is that we will follow through with the funding formula recommended by the funding commission. But I think that's what we're trying to do, to get complete adequacy with the whole basis of the court case that resulted in an 800-page opinion from Commonwealth Court, is that we are unconstitutionally funding our school districts, and we have an obligation to fix that, to ensure that we are making sure that they're adequately funded to be able to provide an appropriate education for kids in every single school district in Pennsylvania.
So let's reflect on that court case for just another minute. Is there anything in their ruling that addresses Pennsylvania's dependence on property taxes for funding our education system?
There is a piece that has been referred to as, through the commission that came forward, tax equity. There are some districts that are maxed out, essentially, or are heavy burden tax paying districts for property taxes to our school districts. And that's what the report reflected, that there's a piece of that $6 billion. $5 billion was towards adequacy, $1 billion was towards tax equity in Pennsylvania over the course of the 7 years, as I mentioned. So that becomes an issue as well, to ensure that as we go forward, that the districts that had been burned but high property taxes will seek some relief through that process.
So, Senator, let's talk about school vouchers, and the governor often refers to that as PASS in his proposal, and this is funding for private and religious schools, and as I know you recall, this kind of derailed budget negotiations a year ago. Is that likely to come up again?
It has been part of the conversations with our Republican colleagues. It continues to be something that Senate Democrats and I believe House Democrats do not want to be part of this conversation. So we are supporting the public education dollars and driving them out to the school districts and not removing that $100 million or whatever along those lines. I would say that one of the conversations that will be in the mix is likely to be the EITC program, tax credit program for school districts or schools across Pennsylvania. So giving families the alternative, if they don't want to do a public school, that they'll have an opportunity to attend a private school and seek and earn a tax credit, educational opportunity tax credit.
So, Senator, you're convinced, and your caucus is convinced, that if we did have PASS, or the school vouchers program, that funding wouldn't necessarily come from the same pot that funds our traditional schools. Tell us more.
No, I believe that they would. I mean, any dollar that's diverted from the basic education line or the adequacy line are dollars that are not being spent on public education, which I think where they need to be spent. That's our position. That's my position. I've long held that position. So I believe a school choice program at $100 million or whatever it might be would take those dollars that should be invested in education through the BEF, or also other special ed and early learning and the like. Directing them elsewhere takes it away from public education. That's what I don't necessarily agree with.
Let's move on to cyber charter schools, because there is debate about possibly reducing funding for cyber charter schools. Your caucus's position on that, please.
We are supportive of reforms to cyber school funding. There's two schools of thought with respect to this. In the past, we used to do charter school reimbursements that we did away with in the Corbett years. But we believe that, so one school of thought is that we do reforms to cyber schools in terms of the amount of money we pay per student. Another school of thought is simply to just provide the charter school cyber school reimbursement as a line item to school district. My concern with the latter is that I think it embeds into place what I've already deemed to be an inequitable system with respect to funding. I think we need to make the reforms that will be there ongoing in future years to be able to maintain and appropriately address the cost there. So we're pushing for what I'll call reforms, more so than we are a charter school reimbursement line. In both instances, if we are not successful in the latter, we'll accept that. But I think we clearly need to make reforms in cyber school and charter school reforms. They're clearly draining a lot of dollars out of our school districts. Significant chunks of the budget of our school districts are impacted by charter school funding, but more specifically, what I deem to be the most onerous and the most offensive is the cyber funding.
So far, we've talked about funding basic education. We've talked about school vouchers, cyber charter schools. Now let's move on to something else, and this has to do with higher education. And I understand there's conversations about grants for students to pursue degrees in high-demand fields. That's interesting. Could that be part of this final budget?
I think it could be. I don't know whether or not we're there yet. It has passed the Senate here. It's something that Senate Democrats, my colleague Senator Vincent Hughes, had championed a number of years ago. And our Republican colleagues have picked it up and advanced it through the Senate, I believe. And I think that it could be something that is there. I think it makes sense. I think it's logical. And it addresses what needs to be done with respect to finding students resources to allow them to work in space that are needed and are industries that are needed going forward. So I do think that it's appropriate. It makes sense. It's just got to be thoughtful, and it's got to be the right number, and it's got to be done in an appropriate way. And the length of time students will be required to remain here. Also, those are all variables or factors that need, I think, to be completely worked out going forward.
Now, the Senate has passed a bill that reduces the personal income tax, and certainly that can get the attention of the public. Do you expect that'll be an element in the coming days?
Well, our colleagues in the Senate Republican caucus have passed that over to the House. I think they would like to see it be the item that we put into place with respect to providing resources back to the public, the taxpaying public. I don't necessarily agree that that's the best way to do it. We think that for low-income folks, it's a very modest or low, moderate reduction. For high-income folks, it's a significant tax reduction. Our belief is, or my belief is, I should say, that we should be doing something in the space of earned income tax credits here in Pennsylvania. Create our own earned income tax credit to allow folks making up to a certain amount of money, maybe it's 150, 175, as a family, to be able to enjoy a tax credit to Pennsylvania, which I think would be far more appropriate. It would impact the people who need it the most, and more importantly, it would help stimulate the economy as well to a much greater degree. And the cost could be associated, could be similar. And that's something we would like to see done. But that's one of the two alternatives that have been talked about. The third alternative with respect to putting money back into people's pockets relates to what Governor Wolf had proposed a couple of years ago, providing a stimulus check to families across Pennsylvania, maybe in the tune of $800,000, $900,000. That would be a one-time expenditure going forward. And as it relates to the income tax reduction or the ITC, or earned income tax credit, you have to recognize that it has an impact in the out years. That's a recurring reduction or expenditure we have to consider on the books, on the financial statements. So as we go forward, whereas the one-time payment is just simply that, a one-time payment that is only going to hit for one time, and then we're back to where we were before.
Senator, you're a veteran of the budget process. How would you compare progress on budget negotiations this year with last year's?
I think they're much better this year than last year. I think there's a tremendous amount of communication from the administration, from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. So I think that the conversations have been going well. I think through this process, Democrats working, House Democrats, Senate Democrats, and the governor's office have been in sync, working together to try to achieve an outcome that I think is acceptable for everyone here, and it gets to the governor's desk, and we can have a bipartisan way in which we provide a balanced budget. But I think they are light years ahead of where we were last year in terms of the communication piece and how we're sharing information.
All right. Thank you very much. Jay Costa, PA Senate Minority Leader. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Enjoy having me.